Frank Schuler had the confirmation letter on his desk. It had arrived from the Saskatchewan Department of Agriculture 3 weeks after he submitted his GRIP enrollment documentation. A clean, official letter confirming that his acreage reduction commitment was accepted, his set-aside field had been verified by the regional agrologist, and his payment would be processed at the established program rate. Frank had read it twice. He had filed it in the blue folder he kept for government program correspondence. He had allowed himself, for the first time in 2 years, to feel that the administrative side of the farm was settled. He was 55 years old and had been farming wheat in the Kindersley district of west central Saskatchewan since 1963. He knew how to manage crop programs. He had participated in federal and provincial set-aside schemes through most of his farming life. He had read the GRIP guidelines carefully. His field selection had been deliberate. His set-aside documentation was complete. He was right about all of that. He was wrong about the red folder. The Gross Revenue Insurance Plan, GRIP, was Saskatchewan's provincial response to the income volatility that had made the mid-1980s difficult for grain farmers across the Canadian prairies. Like its American counterpart programs, it paired production supports with mandatory acreage reduction provisions designed to manage aggregate grain supply. A participating farmer agreed to idle a specified percentage of their eligible crop acreage in exchange for revenue support payments that would buffer against low commodity prices or poor yield years. Frank had enrolled in the spring of 1987. His operation covered 960 acres of cultivated land in Kindersley District, primarily hard red spring wheat, with some canola in rotation on the lighter soils. The GRIP enrollment required him to designate 140 acres as set-aside for the 1987 growing season. Those acres could not be seeded to an eligible crop. They had to be maintained in a summer fallow or approved cover condition through the season. Frank selected the 140 acres from the southwest quarter of his section, a parcel he referred to as the back quarter. The ground was productive but slightly lower yielding than his better acres, and designating it for set-aside made agronomic sense. He had farmed it since purchasing the adjacent quarter section in 1969. He had summer fallowed portions of it in 7 of the last 18 seasons. He knew the field. The regional agrologist from the provincial office completed his field inspection in July. The set-aside acres were properly maintained. No seeding had occurred. The cover was adequate. The agrologist's report was favorable. The confirmation letter followed. Frank placed it in the blue folder. In early October 1987, Frank received a different letter. This one came from the Federal Agricultural and Rural Development Administration office in Regina, not from the provincial department. It was addressed to him by name and referenced a specific legal land description. The southwest quarter of his section, the back quarter, the same 140 acres he had designated as GRIP, set aside. The letter notified him that an ARDA compliance review had identified a potential violation of the use restrictions associated with the ARDA improvement agreement registered on that parcel in 1974. The review found that the parcel had been enrolled in a provincial acreage reduction program for the 1987 season, and that the conditions of the ARDA agreement restricted the use of that specific land to approved agricultural purposes as defined in the original agreement, which did not include participation in government set-aside programs that required the land to be removed from active production. Frank read the letter 3 times. Then he went to the cabinet in the back room, where he filed documents he didn't need immediately, organized by rough category, taxes, equipment, land records, old government papers. The red folder was in the old government papers section. It was thin. 4 pages, a cover letter, an agreement form with conditions listed in numbered paragraphs, and a schedule describing the drainage improvement area. Federal letterhead, Agriculture Canada, dated April 1974. His father's signature at the bottom of the agreement form, in the handwriting Frank had known his whole life. He read it the way he should have read it in 1979 when he inherited the farm. Not as a historical record of something his father had done, but as a live document describing what the land was required to do. Condition 4A. The improved land area, as described in Schedule B, shall be maintained in active agricultural production, including but not limited to the growing of grain crops, oil seeds, or other
approved field crops for a period not less than 20 years from the date of this agreement. Condition 4B. The landowner or operator shall not voluntarily remove the improved land from production for any period exceeding 60 consecutive days during the growing season, except as required by approved crop rotation practices. Condition 4C. Participation in federal or provincial acreage reduction, set-aside, or land diversion programs shall not satisfy the production requirement of this agreement and shall constitute a violation of Condition 4A, unless prior written approval is obtained from the administering authority. Frank had idled the back quarter for the entire 1987 growing season. The improved drainage area, the 30 northern acres, had been fallow since April. The ARDA agreement had prohibited exactly this. Not because the land was broken or the drainage had failed, because his father had accepted federal improvement money 13 years ago and signed a document that made the land's productive use a federal condition for 20 years. Frank had not known about Condition 4C. He had not known about any of the conditions in any operative sense. He had known the folder existed. He had not known it was still relevant. The Agricultural and Rural Development Act was a federal Canadian program established in the early 1960s to address structural poverty and low agricultural productivity in rural areas. In Saskatchewan, RDA agreements were used through the 1960s and 1970s to fund land improvement projects, drainage work, soil reclamation, brush clearing, water control structures, on agricultural land that met specific eligibility criteria. A landowner who received ARDA funding entered into a registered agreement that specified the improvement work to be completed and attached ongoing use conditions to the parcel. These use conditions were not temporary. They were registered as encumbrances on the land title and remained in effect for the term specified in the original agreement, typically 15 to 20 years, or until formally discharged by the administering authority. An ARDA encumbrance did not require the landowner to do anything annually to maintain it. It did not generate annual renewal notices. It sat in the land registry, running its term, requiring compliance from whoever owned or operated the land, whether or not they knew it was there. Frank's father had owned the back quarter from 1958 until his death in 1979. The ARDA improvement agreement he signed in 1974 had funded drainage work on the lower-lying northern portion of the parcel, approximately 30 acres prone to seasonal waterlogging. The federal contribution was $4,800, substantial in 1974 for a localized drainage project. The agreement's 20-year production requirement was standard for RDA drainage agreements of that period. The federal government was investing in land improvement on the explicit expectation that the improved land would produce for 2 decades. The RDA agreement ran to 1994. Frank had inherited the land when his father died. He had received the title documents, the survey plan, the insurance records, and a box of his father's farm files. The red folder was in that box. He had reviewed it briefly and filed it under old government papers, because that was what it appeared to be. The agreement was 13 years old, signed before Frank had owned the land, and nothing in the 8 years since he had taken over the operation had given him any reason to return to it. No one had contacted him about it. No renewal notice had arrived. No reminder of any kind had come from the ARDA administration, which had been folded into Agriculture Canada's regional operations in the late 1970s as the program wound down its active phase. The agreement was in the registry. It was in the land title records at the Land Titles Office in Kindersley, available to anyone who searched the title on that quarter section. Frank had not searched the title on ground he had been farming since 1979. He had no reason to expect it contained an encumbrance that would affect how he could participate in a 1987 provincial crop program. Here is the specific situation Frank found himself in, and why it is worth understanding precisely. He had read the GRIP program guidelines. He understood the set-aside requirements. He had verified that his selected parcel met the GRIP eligibility criteria. It was cultivated land, properly classified within the eligible crop base. The provincial agrologist had inspected it and confirmed compliance. The confirmation letter had arrived. Under GRIP, Frank Schuler was a compliant participant. He had not read the 1974 ARDA agreement, or rather, he had not read it with the attention its current relevance required. He had reviewed it as a historical document, not as an active land use restriction. He had not known that it contained a specific prohibition on removing the improved acreage from active production for the duration of its 20-year term. 2 programs, 1 field, 2 independent administrative frameworks, 2 different federal or provincial departments, 2 different definitions of what the land was required to do. GRIP required the land to be removed from production. ARDA required the land to remain in production. Frank had satisfied the first requirement. He had thereby violated the second. Neither program had any mechanism for cross-checking against the other. The provincial GRIP office did not query federal land registry records for RD encumbrances before accepting a set-aside enrollment. The federal RDA administration did not notify participants when their land was enrolled in provincial programs that might conflict with ARDA conditions. Both programs operated within their own administrative frameworks, with their own eligibility rules, their own compliance reviews, and their own enforcement mechanisms. The farmer, standing between them, was expected to know about both. The ARDA violation finding meant that Frank's GRIP payment, $6,200 for the 140-acre set-aside commitment, was subject to clawback. The federal ARDA office had issued a demand for recovery of an unspecified portion of the improvement funding proportional to the violation period. Both amounts together represented a net loss of approximately $8,400 from what Frank had expected to receive as a straightforward program payment for fallowing a field he had managed for 24 years. The resolution took most of the winter. Frank hired an agricultural lawyer in Swift Current who had experience with federal land agreement disputes. The lawyer's first task was to obtain a full copy of the 1974 RDA agreement and the current title abstract for the back quarter. The title abstract confirmed the ARDA encumbrance. It was there, registered, clear, and had been in the record continuously since 1974. The lawyer then reviewed the ARDA agreement's terms against the specific land use. His position was that the 30-acre drainage improvement area covered by the original ARDA funding was a subset of the 140-acre set-aside parcel, and that the restriction should apply only to the improved acreage, not to the entire quarter section. If the set-aside had been structured to exclude the 30 drainage acres from the ARDA encumbered area, the conflict might have been avoided entirely or substantially reduced. This argument had some merit. Agriculture Canada's regional office reviewed it. After a protracted correspondence, they agreed to calculate the violation on the basis of the 30 improved acres rather than the full 140. The clawback demand was reduced from the initial estimate to a final figure of $1,840, a proportional recovery of RDA improvement funding attributable to the specific acreage that had been improved under the original agreement. The GRIP payment was ultimately paid in full, with a deduction for a documentation fee related to the dispute processing. Frank's net outcome was a reduction of approximately $2,200 from his expected program receipts for 1987. The back quarter remained in summer fallow for the 1987 season, as originally enrolled. The ARDA encumbrance continued to run. Frank arranged to have its terms formally noted in his farm file in a way that would be visible the next time he considered set-aside enrollment on that parcel. The lesson that Frank's situation illustrates is not unique to the specific programs involved, and it is not unique to Canada. The structural problem is universal wherever government agricultural programs accumulate over time and register ongoing obligations against farmland that passes from one operator to another. An RDA improvement agreement registered in 1974 creates an obligation that runs with the land. It does not expire when the original signatory dies. It does not reset when the land changes hands. It does not send notices. It simply continues, registered in the title system, requiring compliance from whoever operates the land until its term expires or it is formally discharged. When a new program arrives, GRIP in 1987, or any provincial or federal scheme that affects how enrolled land may be used, the farmer enrolled in that new program bears the responsibility of knowing whether any older registered obligations on the land conflict with the new program's requirements. Neither program administrator takes responsibility for cross-checking. Neither sends a warning. The responsibility falls entirely on the operator. Frank had read the GRIP guidelines correctly. His set-aside was procedurally perfect. His field was inspected and approved. His compliance under GRIP was complete. The violation was not in what he read. It was in what he did not know to look for. A 13-year-old agreement registered against a parcel of land that he had worked for 24 years without ever receiving a notice, a renewal, or any indication that the obligation was still running. Compliant doesn't mean clear. A farm operation can simultaneously satisfy every requirement of a current program while unknowingly violating the terms of a program that ended its active administration years earlier, but left its conditions registered against the title. The two states are not mutually exclusive. They coexist whenever older obligations and newer programs share the same land. The back quarter produced its next wheat crop in 1988. The RDA encumbrance ran until 1994. Frank checked the title every time he enrolled in a set-aside program after that.